Jason, frustrated and eager to prove his strength, took another step forward. He raised his hand, preparing to push Charles again. But Charles's eyes sharpened, and in that instant, he was ready. Without a word, he turned quickly, using his cane to deflect Jason's push. The teens watched in shock as Jason stumbled backward, off balance. Jason tried to recover, but it was too late. Charles, with the speed and precision of a trained fighter, moved swiftly and blocked another of Jason's advances. The push Jason had made earlier now turned into a stumbling motion. He tripped and fell onto the grass, unable to keep his balance. The other teens stood frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They hadn't expected the old man to fight back, especially not like this. Charles stood tall, his eyes calm but steady. The cane, which they had mocked earlier, was now a symbol of his strength. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Jason, now on the ground, looked up at Charles with wide eyes. He had thought this would be an easy target, but now he saw the mistake he had made. His friends were equally stunned, realizing they had underestimated the old man. Charles didn't waste any more time. He slowly stepped back, allowing the teens to process what had just happened. They had come to the park looking for trouble, but instead they had met a man who would teach them a lesson they would never forget. The moment hung in the air as the group of teens realized that their bullying had consequences. They had targeted the wrong person, and now they would have to face the truth of their actions. But Charles, with his calm demeanor, didn't want to escalate the situation further. He turned and continued his walk, leaving the teens behind. He knew that sometimes the best way to teach a lesson was not through violence, but through quiet strength. The teens had learned a valuable lesson today, but whether they would change their ways was yet to be seen. Charles walked away from the group, his heart steady, his mind at peace. He knew he had done the right thing. And as he disappeared into the distance, the teens watched in silence, forever changed by the encounter with the old man they had tried to bully. The consequences. As Charles continued his walk through the park, the group of teens remained in stunned silence. They couldn't believe what had just happened. The old man they had expected to cower had instead turned the tables on them with skill and confidence. For a moment, the teens exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say or do next. Jason, who had been the most aggressive of the group, was the first to recover from the shock. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off his clothes. His pride had been hurt, but there was something else in his eyes now, something that made him think twice about his actions. He had never expected to be outsmarted by an old man, let alone one who was clearly capable of defending himself so well. What the hell was that? Jason muttered, still trying to process the scene. One of his friends, Mark, finally spoke up, his voice filled with confusion. I don't get it. He was just an old man. How did he do that? He was way faster than I thought. The group was starting to question what had just happened. They had come to the park expecting to have fun at the expense of an elderly man, but now they were left with more questions than answers. Charles had not only defended himself, but had done so with a quiet strength that they couldn't ignore. They had underestimated him, and it was clear that their actions had consequences. But not all of the teens were willing to admit that they had been in the wrong. Jason's pride still burned, and he wasn't ready to let go of his sense of superiority just yet. That old man got lucky, he said, his voice full of bitterness. He won't get away with this next time. The others hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Deep down, they knew that what they had done was wrong, but Jason's words carried weight. He was the leader of their group, and they often followed his lead without question. Mark, however, spoke up again, this time with a more thoughtful tone. Do you really want to go after him again? He could have hurt you back there. He was way too fast for us. Jason shot him a look, but Mark wasn't backing down. Look, I'm just saying, maybe we should leave him alone. What's the point of picking on someone like that? We made a fool of ourselves, and I don't think it's worth it. Jason's face reddened with frustration, but the other teens were starting to agree with Mark. They had seen Charles's skill firsthand, and they didn't want to risk making the situation worse. But Jason wasn't ready to back down. He had a reputation to uphold, and he wasn't about to let an old man humiliate him like that. "I'll show him," Jason muttered under his breath. "I'm not scared of some old guy with a cane." As the group lingered in the park, their mood shifted from one of excitement to unease. They had come there to have fun, but instead they had encountered something they hadn't expected. An elderly man who wasn't afraid to defend himself. Jason's arrogance had led them into this situation, and now the group was left with a decision to make. Should they walk away and learn from the experience, or should they push forward and try to get even? Meanwhile, Charles had no idea what was happening behind him. He was simply continuing his walk, his mind at peace. He had been through enough in his life to know that conflict wasn't always the answer. He had faced many challenges, both in his youth and as an adult, but he had learned to approach life with patience and understanding. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he also knew that standing up for himself was important. As he reached the end of the park, Charles heard footsteps behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming someone was just passing by. But then he heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. He turned around to see Jason and the rest of the group walking toward him again, their faces determined but nervous. Charles could sense the tension in the air. He knew they had come to apologize, but there was still a hint of arrogance in their stance. He didn't move, standing tall and calm as they approached him. Jason was the first to speak. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "We just wanted to say, well, we're sorry about what happened. We shouldn't have picked on you." The words didn't come easily to him. Jason wasn't used to admitting he was wrong. But as he stood there, facing Charles, he realized that he couldn't go on pretending that his actions had been justified. The look on Charles's face earlier, the calm strength, had made him think about things in a way he hadn't before. Charles studied him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. He had seen many people in his life, and he knew when someone was truly sorry and when they were just saying the words. He nodded slowly, accepting their apology without saying much. There was no need for a long speech. Actions spoke louder than words, and Jason and his friends were beginning to understand that. "It's all right," Charles said, his voice calm and steady. "Just remember, respect is earned, not given." The teens stood in silence for a moment, processing his words. They had learned a valuable lesson today, one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. They had thought they could get away with bullying an older man, but instead, they had been taught humility and respect. As the group slowly walked away, Charles continued his walk, his mind clear. He didn't need their apology to feel good about himself. He knew that he had made a difference, not by fighting back, but by showing them the strength that comes from within. And that, he thought, was the most important lesson of all. The teens had learned the hard way that there were consequences for their actions. And for Charles, the victory wasn't in the physical fight, but in the realization that respect and dignity could never be taken away, no matter how hard someone tried. Mark, however, spoke up again, this time with a more thoughtful tone. "Do you really want to go after him again? He could have hurt you back there. He was way too fast for us." Jason shot him a look, but Mark wasn't backing down. "Look, I'm just saying, maybe we should leave him alone. What's the point of picking on someone like that? We made a fool of ourselves, and I don't think it's worth it." Jason's face reddened with frustration, but the other teens were starting to agree with Mark. They had seen Charles's skill firsthand, and they didn't want to risk making the situation worse. But Jason wasn't ready to back down. He had a reputation to uphold, and he wasn't about to let an old man humiliate him like that. "I'll show him," Jason muttered under his breath. "I'm not scared of some old guy with a cane." As the group lingered in the park, their mood shifted from one of excitement to unease. They had come there to have fun, but instead they had encountered something they hadn't expected. an elderly man who wasn't afraid to defend himself. Jason's arrogance had led them into this situation, and now the group was left with a decision to make. Should they walk away and learn from the experience, or should they push forward and try to get even? Meanwhile, Charles had no idea what was happening behind him. He was simply continuing his walk, his mind at peace. He had been through enough in his life to know that conflict wasn't always the answer. He had faced many challenges, both in his youth and as an adult, but he had learned to approach life with patience and understanding. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he also knew that standing up for himself was important. As he reached the end of the park, Charles heard footsteps behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming someone was just passing by. But then, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. He turned around to see Jason and the rest of the group walking toward him again, their faces determined but nervous. Charles could sense the tension in the air. He knew they had come to apologize, but there was still a hint of arrogance in their stance. He didn't move, standing tall and calm as they approached him. Jason was the first to speak. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "We just wanted to say, well, we're sorry about what happened. We shouldn't have picked on you." The words didn't come easily to him. Jason wasn't used to admitting he was wrong. But as he stood there, facing Charles, he realized that he couldn't go on pretending that his actions had been justified. The look on Charles's face earlier, the calm strength, had made him think about things in a way he hadn't before. Charles studied him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. He had seen many people in his life, and he knew when someone was truly sorry and when they were just saying the words. He nodded slowly, accepting their apology without saying much. There was no need for a long speech. Actions spoke louder than words, and Jason and his friends were beginning to understand that. "It's all right," Charles said, his voice calm and steady. "Just remember, respect is earned, not given." The teens stood in silence for a moment, processing his words. They had learned a valuable lesson today, one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. They had thought they could get away with bullying an older man, but instead, they had been taught humility and respect. As the group slowly walked away, Charles continued his walk, his mind clear. He didn't need their apology to feel good about himself. He knew that he had made a difference, not by fighting back, but by showing them the strength that comes from within. And that, he thought, was the most important lesson of all. The teens had learned the hard way that there were consequences for their actions. And for Charles, the victory wasn't in the physical fight, but in the realization that respect and dignity could never be taken away, no matter how hard someone tried. The challenge. The days following the encounter in the park were strangely quiet. For Charles, life continued as usual. He maintained his routine, enjoying his peaceful walks through the park, always with a sense of calm confidence. But for Jason and his friends, the events of that day lingered in their minds, refusing to fade away. Jason couldn't shake the image of Charles standing there, calm and unshaken, while he and his friends had acted like bullies. They had come at him with the arrogance of youth, but they hadn't expected to be outmatched by an old man. The more Jason thought about it, the angrier he became. No one made a fool of him like that. Jason was determined to show his friends that he wasn't afraid of Charles. He needed to prove that he could handle someone like him. He had to make sure they knew he was still the leader, the one they all followed. "We're going back," Jason said one evening as he sat with Mark, one of his closest friends, in his garage. Mark looked up from the skateboard he was fixing, an uncertain look crossing his face. "What do you mean, we're going back?" "We're going back to the park," Jason said, his voice firm. "We can't just let it go. I'm not letting that old guy get away with making us look weak. We'll show him who's really in charge." Mark hesitated, looking at Jason with a mixture of concern and doubt. "I don't know, man. He's not like anyone we've dealt with before. You saw how fast he moved. And he was calm, like he wasn't even worried." "That's the point," Jason shot back. He thinks he can scare us, but he can't. We'll make sure he knows who he's dealing with. We can handle it." Mark knew better than to argue when Jason was this determined. He also knew that Jason didn't back down easily, especially not when his pride was on the line. But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. The next afternoon, the group of teens met up again. Jason had gathered them all at his house, and they were preparing for their return to the park. The same park where, just days earlier, they had tried to intimidate Charles. This time, Jason had a different plan. "We're not going to just walk up to him and start trouble," Jason said, addressing the group. "We're going to be smart about it. We'll challenge him, see if he's really all that great. He might know some karate, but we've got strength in numbers." The others were still a little uneasy, but Jason's confidence was infectious. They followed him to the park, their footsteps echoing in the quiet afternoon. As they neared the park, Jason's heart began to race. Part of him still couldn't believe he was doing this. The other part was determined to show Charles who was really in charge. They reached the same spot where they had confronted Charles days before, and Jason's eyes scanned the area for any sign of him. He was there. Charles was sitting on the same bench, just as calm as before, his hands folded in his lap. He looked up as Jason and the others approached, his expression unreadable. Jason felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. He was going to make sure Charles knew that he wasn't some old man to be messed with. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice loud and challenging. "Hey, old man, we're back. You think you can just humiliate us like that and get away with it?" Charles didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Jason, his eyes calm and steady. It was as if he could sense Jason's need to prove something, and he wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Jason was getting impatient. "What, you think you can just sit there and ignore us? You want to go again? Let's see if your old body can handle more." The rest of the group stood behind Jason, watching in silence. No one said a word, but there was a tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Charles finally stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked at Jason, then at the group of teens standing behind him. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Fighting isn't the answer. It never is." Jason scoffed. "You're just scared, old man. You're afraid to face real competition." "I'm not afraid," Charles replied calmly. "But I've lived long enough to know that pride and arrogance don't win anything. You might be strong, but strength doesn't mean you can bully others into submission." Jason's face reddened, and for a brief moment he hesitated. There was something in Charles's voice, something wise and grounded, that made him second-guess himself. But the pride inside him quickly rose to the surface. "Enough talk," Jason snapped. "Let's see what you've really got." The others exchanged nervous glances. Mark, in particular, was feeling uneasy about the whole situation. He didn't want to see anyone get hurt, and he knew that Charles wasn't someone to be underestimated. But Jason had made up his mind, and there was no turning back now. As the tension grew, Charles took a deep breath and looked at the teens one last time. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, his voice low but firm. "But if you want to test yourselves, then I won't stop you. Just know that you're not fighting the man you think I am." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Let's see what you've got then." With that, the challenge was set. The teens had underestimated Charles before, but now they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. The stage was set for something none of them could have predicted. And soon, they would learn that strength was more than just physical power. It was about wisdom, patience, and the ability to walk away when it mattered most. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. Jason and his friends were about to face a lesson they would never forget. The showdown. The tension in the park was palpable. Jason's pulse raced as he stared at Charles, who stood across from him with an unwavering calmness. His friends looked at each other, unsure of what would happen next. They had followed Jason here, but now, As they stood in the shadow of a man who exuded quiet strength, doubt crept into their minds. Jason couldn't back down now. His pride wouldn't let him. He took a deep breath and cracked his knuckles. "All right, old man. Let's see what you've got," he taunted, trying to mask the nerves that suddenly crept up on him. Charles didn't react to the challenge. His hands remained at his sides, his posture relaxed. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, as if speaking to someone who didn't yet understand the consequences of their actions. "But if you want to test your strength, I'll show you how wrong you are." With those words, Charles moved with surprising speed. His body flowed like water, each movement precise and controlled. He didn't need to make a show of it. His power came from his stillness and his knowledge. As Jason lunged forward, throwing a punch in the air, Charles sidestepped him effortlessly, his movements so fluid they seemed almost effortless. Jason staggered, caught off guard by the older man's speed. He wasn't expecting someone of Charles's age to move like that. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, quickly adjusting and trying again. This time, he aimed a series of punches at Charles's chest, thinking that brute force might work better. But Charles, with ease, blocked each blow, his arms flowing like water, redirecting the strikes with barely any effort. It wasn't long before Jason realized that he wasn't just fighting someone older. He was fighting someone who knew exactly how to use their body. Mark and the others watched in shock, their mouths hanging open as they witnessed the old man's skill. They hadn't expected this. In fact, none of them had imagined for a second that Charles would be so fast or so precise. Jason was the one who was supposed to be in control. Yet here he was, struggling against an elderly man who seemed to have the strength of someone much younger. Jason, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt, gritted his teeth and pushed harder. He charged at Charles, desperate to land just one punch, but Charles was already moving. As Jason came at him with all his might, Charles moved to the side and, with a quick flick of his wrist, redirected Jason's momentum. Jason went tumbling to the ground, unable to regain his balance. A hushed silence fell over the group. Jason lay on the grass, staring up at the sky in disbelief. He had been defeated, not by someone younger and stronger, but by an elderly man who had made it look easy. "You're strong, Jason," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "But strength isn't just about power. It's about control. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Jason's face burned with embarrassment. He wasn't used to being outmatched. He had always been the one who had the upper hand in every situation. But here, in front of his friends, he had been shown just how much he still had to learn. "Get up, man," Mark said quietly, as he reached down to help Jason back to his feet. The others stood around, unsure of what to say. They had come here expecting one thing, but what they had witnessed was completely different. They had seen a side of Charles they never knew existed, a side they hadn't thought possible from someone his age. Jason pushed Mark's hand away and stood up on his own. He wasn't going to admit defeat, not yet. "This isn't over," he muttered, wiping the dirt off his clothes. But there was a shift in his eyes, a flicker of understanding that hadn't been there before. Charles watched him with a look of quiet compassion. "I don't want to fight you," he said gently. "But sometimes, fighting doesn't give you the answers you think it will. There are better ways to find your strength." Jason didn't say anything. He didn't know how to respond. His world had just been turned upside down in a matter of minutes, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that his strength would carry him through. But now, in the face of someone who had lived a much longer life and seen much more than he had, Jason realized just how little he truly knew about true strength. The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. They had come to challenge Charles, but they had left with more questions than answers. What was true strength? What did it mean to be strong? Charles didn't offer any answers. He simply looked at Jason, his eyes kind but unyielding. "You'll figure it out," he said quietly. But you've got to be willing to listen. Jason stared at him for a long moment, his pride bruised but his mind beginning to churn with thoughts he had never considered before. He had always believed that strength was about power, about being the biggest and the toughest. But Charles had just shown him something entirely different. Strength wasn't just about size or force. It was about knowledge, control, and knowing when to walk away. As Jason and his friends left the park that day, they didn't just walk away from a fight. They walked away with a lesson that would change them forever. But whether they truly understood it or not was still to be seen. The lesson had been taught, but the journey to understanding was just beginning. What would happen next? Only time would tell. The revelation. The next day, Jason and his friends gathered at their usual hangout spot, but the events of yesterday still lingered in the air. Jason's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the image of Charles, the way he had effortlessly blocked every one of his punches, the calmness in his movements, and most of all, the wisdom in his words. For the first time in his life, Jason felt as though he had been forced to see the world through a different lens, a lens he wasn't sure he liked. "Man, I still can't believe it," Mark said, shaking his head as they sat down in the corner booth of their favorite diner. "That guy is freaking unstoppable. I've never seen anyone move like that." "Yeah, it was like he wasn't even trying," Jason replied, though he was far from impressed. He had been humiliated, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. "I don't get it. He's old, way older than us. How the hell does he move like that?" The others in the group were equally perplexed. "Maybe he's been doing that stuff his whole life," one of them suggested. "You know, like karate or something." "Karate?" Jason scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on. He looks like some random old man. He can't possibly be some kind of martial arts master." But even as he said the words, doubts began to creep in. Jason had been sure he would win yesterday, confident that his youthful strength and energy would overpower Charles. But Charles had shattered that belief with every movement he made. Jason couldn't stop replaying the fight in his mind. The way Charles had sidestepped him, effortlessly dodging his attacks. The way he had redirected his strength and made him fall to the ground. No one had ever made Jason feel so weak, so outmatched. As he sat there in silence, his mind swirling with confusion, a sudden thought struck him. What if Charles was more than just a random old man? What if he was exactly what the group had suspected, someone who had spent years mastering martial arts? But that would mean he wasn't just some weak old man. He was a force to be reckoned with. Jason had to know more. He couldn't just let the mystery slip away. If Charles was hiding something, Jason was determined to figure it out. "I'm gonna go talk to him," Jason muttered, his voice low and determined. "What?" Mark asked, looking up in surprise. "Are you crazy? After what happened yesterday, you want to go back there and get embarrassed again?" "I don't care about that," Jason snapped. "I need to know who he really is. There's something about him. He's not just some random guy. He's got something, and I need to figure it out." Mark exchanged a glance with the others. They weren't sure if it was a good idea, but they all knew Jason well enough to understand that once he set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. "You sure about this?" Mark asked cautiously. "Yeah, I'm sure." Jason stood up abruptly, heading for the door with a determined look on his face. His friends followed reluctantly, unsure of what to expect next. They had seen Jason fight hard in the past, but this wasn't about brute strength. It was about something deeper, something that neither Jason nor his friends had anticipated. As Jason and his friends arrived at the park, they spotted Charles sitting on the same bench from the day before. He was calm and collected, as if nothing had changed. His gray hair glistened in the sunlight, and his posture remained straight. He looked almost too peaceful, too wise. He seemed to know exactly what was coming. Jason hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Hey," he called out, his voice quieter than he expected. Charles looked up slowly, a small smile crossing his face. "You've come back," he said simply. "I knew you would." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you know?" Charles chuckled softly. "Sometimes, the journey to understanding takes time. You're starting to realize that, aren't you?" Jason swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say. He had come here to confront Charles, to challenge him in some way. But now that he was face to face with him, he felt uncertain. "I don't get it," Jason admitted, his voice almost apologetic. "I thought I knew what it meant to be strong. But after yesterday, I feel weak. How do you do it? How do you make it look so easy?" Charles studied him for a moment before speaking. "Strength isn't about fighting. It's not about who can hit the hardest or throw the most punches. Strength comes from within. It's about control, patience, and understanding. The hardest battles are often the ones you never have to fight." Jason listened intently, trying to absorb the words, but they didn't make sense. "So, you're saying I shouldn't fight? That I should just walk away from everything?" "No," Charles replied, shaking his head. "I'm saying that sometimes the best way to fight is by not fighting at all. There's power in restraint, in knowing when to hold back and when to let go." Jason stood there, stunned. His world had just been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about strength, about power, had been challenged in the span of a single conversation. The silence stretched on for a few moments before Jason finally spoke. "So, you're saying you're not just some old guy?" he asked, almost unsure of what he was asking. Charles smiled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I've lived a long life, Jason, and in that time, I've learned more about strength than I could ever explain in words. But the lesson, the real lesson, is this: strength isn't about defeating others. It's about understanding yourself." Jason stood there, his thoughts swirling in 100 different directions. He had come here looking for answers, and now he had more questions than ever. But one thing was clear: he was on the verge of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. As he left the park that day, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change. The lesson Charles had taught him wasn't just a lesson in martial arts. It was a lesson in life itself, a lesson that Jason would carry with him for the rest of his days. What would happen next? Jason didn't know yet, but he knew that the journey had just begun. And the lessons, the real lessons, were waiting just around the corner. The fight within. The days that followed were full of reflection for Jason. What Charles had said to him that afternoon haunted him, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how true the old man's words were. Jason's whole life had been built around strength, physical strength, mental toughness, and the belief that fighting for what you want was the way to get ahead in the world. But now, that understanding seemed so small, so limited. Jason spent less time with his friends and more time on his own, thinking about the fight he had started in the park. But it wasn't just about fighting anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the internal struggle. This battle between who he thought he was and who he could become. The more Jason pondered it, the more frustrated he became. Could he really change? Could he truly learn from someone like Charles, an old man who seemed to have it all figured out? One afternoon, Jason decided to seek out Charles again. This time, it wasn't out of anger or pride, but something different, something that had been growing inside him since their last conversation. He wanted to understand more. He needed to know if he could actually change. Walking through the park toward the familiar bench, Jason's heart raced. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping for, but something inside him urged him to keep moving forward. As he approached the bench, he saw Charles sitting there, just as he had before. The old man's eyes glinted with recognition, and Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. Charles looked up and smiled warmly. "I knew you'd be back," he said gently. Jason took a deep breath and sat down beside him, a bit nervously. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he admitted. "I don't know if I understand it all yet, but I want to try. I want to be different. I don't want to just fight anymore. But I'm scared. Charles nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's natural to be scared, Jason. Change isn't easy. But fear is a part of growth. You have to face it, not run from it. And sometimes the hardest part is letting go of what you thought you knew. Jason's brow furrowed. But how do I do that? I've spent my whole life believing that strength means fighting. How do I learn something new when everything I've known has been built on that? Charles' expression softened. You start by accepting that you don't know everything. You open yourself to new possibilities. And you understand that true strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about mastering yourself. Jason felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. The simplicity of Charles's words carried so much weight, so much truth. He had been trying to overpower the world around him, thinking that would make him strong. But in doing so, he had never stopped to truly understand his own mind, his own emotions. He had been fighting against the wrong things. What if I fail? Jason asked quietly. What if I can't change? Charles looked at him with calm reassurance. Failure is just another lesson. You only truly fail when you stop trying. Jason sat in silence, letting those words sink in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had permission to fail and to learn from it. He wasn't expected to be perfect. He wasn't expected to have it all figured out right away. All he had to do was try. Charles leaned forward slightly. You see, Jason, strength comes from within. It's about being patient with yourself, understanding your own weaknesses, and using that knowledge to grow stronger. True strength comes from compassion toward yourself and others. When you learn to be kind, not just to others, but to yourself, that's when you'll understand what real power is. Jason nodded slowly, feeling something change inside him. He wasn't sure exactly what would happen next, but he knew this. He had taken the first step on a new path. It wasn't going to be easy, and he would likely face challenges along the way. But he was determined to change. The next day, Jason returned to the park again. This time, he wasn't just trying to learn martial arts or prove anything to himself. He was there to observe, to learn, and to embrace the lessons that Charles had shared with him. He watched as Charles practiced his movements, slow and deliberate, every motion controlled and purposeful. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The old man wasn't just a fighter. He was a teacher, a guide. Jason sat on a nearby bench, studying Charles closely. It wasn't just about the martial arts now. It was about the mindset, the focus, and the inner peace that came with it. For the first time in his life, Jason began to understand that strength didn't come from aggression. It came from understanding. It came from knowing when to fight and when to walk away. As the days passed, Jason spent more time with Charles, learning not only the physical techniques, but the mental discipline that came with martial arts. Charles had become more than just a mentor. He had become a symbol of everything Jason wanted to be. Strong, wise, patient, and at peace with himself. But Jason's journey was far from over. The real test would come when he had to put everything he had learned into practice. Would he be able to control his anger? Would he be able to face his fears head-on and remain calm? Jason didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to find out. And as he continued to learn, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about martial arts anymore. This was about life. And Jason was finally starting to see the bigger picture, the final test. Weeks had passed since Jason began training with Charles. The lessons were no longer about just defending himself or proving his strength through fighting. They had evolved into something much deeper. Each day, Jason found himself not only improving his physical abilities, but also strengthening his mind. The self-doubt that had once controlled him was slowly being replaced by confidence and understanding. But despite the progress, Jason knew there was still one thing left to confront: his pride. His past actions, the bullying, the reckless decisions, they were a part of him, but they didn't have to define him. It was time to prove to himself and the world that he could be more than what others expected of him. That he could be someone who lived by the lessons he had learned, not someone who fell back into old habits when things got tough. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Jason saw a group of teenagers hanging out by the bench where he had first met Charles. He didn't recognize them, but their attitude was all too familiar. They were loud, throwing insults at people passing by, their laughter echoing in the air. Jason noticed one of them, a younger kid, was getting closer to an elderly man who was sitting nearby. Jason didn't know who the man was, but he had an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. As he watched, the situation began to escalate. The young teen started mocking the elderly man, laughing as the old man tried to ignore him. Jason's heart began to race. It wasn't the first time he had seen this kind of behavior, but it felt different this time. This time, he wasn't just a bystander. This time, he was a man who had learned better. Without thinking, Jason stepped forward, his voice firm and calm. "Hey, leave him alone," he said, his words cutting through the laughter of the teenagers. They stopped and looked at him, confusion and defiance written on their faces. Jason wasn't sure what he expected, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. One of the teens, a tall boy with a cocky smile, took a step forward. "You got a problem," he sneered. "This old man doesn't matter. Get out of here." Jason's fists clenched, but he didn't let anger take over. He had learned from Charles. This wasn't about fighting. This was about standing up for what was right without letting his emotions control him. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason replied evenly. "You need to show respect. No one deserves to be treated like this." The teen scoffed, clearly thinking Jason was just another person trying to act tough. But Jason wasn't backing down. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm but strong. For a moment, it seemed like the situation would escalate into violence. But then something remarkable happened. The older man, who had been quietly watching from his seat, stood up. He was shorter than Jason, but walked with a presence that commanded attention. The teens looked at him in confusion, but Jason felt a sense of relief. This was Charles. The teens froze, unsure of what to make of the elderly man now standing tall before them. They had no idea who he was, but Jason did. And he knew that Charles wasn't someone to mess with. "Jason's right," Charles said, his voice steady and authoritative. "Respect is earned, but it's also freely given. And none of you have earned the right to treat others like this."